Deaths and burials of the kings and queens of England. The Plantagenets. All men must die, even kings, and not even a golden crown can pay off the Grim Reaper. In this 4-part series, we'll bid a final farewell to all 58 deceased English and British monarchs, from Æthelstan to Elizabeth II. We'll dig up their medical records and deathbed secrets, uncover where and how they were buried, and reveal if their remains rest in peace. In this episode, we'll bury the Plantagenet Kings, several of whom died of dysentery before it was cool, or had a hard time staying alive while imprisoned by their own relatives. You can see the whole series now for as little as $1 on Patreon. And now, let's offer our condolences to the Plantagenets. Henry II was crowned at 21 alongside his wife, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. As he claimed the throne through his mother, Matilda, he launched a new dynasty, named after his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet. The king's argument with Thomas Becket, Bishop of Canterbury, led him to utter the famous line, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" 4 loyal knights took him at his word and sliced off the top of Becket's head. Henry and Eleanor's marriage crumbled, and she encouraged their sons to rebel against their father. Only the youngest, John, remained loyal. Fearing his little brother would be named successor, the eldest, Richard, went to war against his father. After a defeat in France, the king fell ill and lost the will to fight on in the oppressive summer heat. Richard pushed on and forced his dying father into a humiliating surrender. When Henry was read a list of Richard's supporters, the first name was John. The king was heartbroken by the betrayal and collapsed in shock and fever. He was carried back to his castle, where he died at 56. He wished to be interred at Gramont Abbey, but the July heat made transporting the body impractical, and he was instead buried at nearby Fontevraud Abbey in France. His estranged wife, Eleanor, was later laid beside him. Henry II now spends eternity with the woman who broke his heart. Richard I had been raised on stories of chivalrous heroes. He had no interest in the drudgery of governing, and instead chased glory on crusade and in ill-advised battles with France. His follies nearly bankrupted England. While bullying the small and poorly defended castle of Châlus-Chabrol, Richard, who clearly thought he was invincible, was walking around with no armor. He was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow. The shot was not mortal, and physicians removed the arrow, but the wound turned gangrenous, and he was on his deathbed, writhing in fever for 11 days. When his men stormed the castle, the king ordered that the bowman who had landed him the fatal blow be brought before him. The assassin turned out to be a young boy. Fearing he would be executed, the child defiantly uttered that Richard had killed his father and 2 of his brothers, and deserved to die. The boy was dumbstruck when Richard gave him 100 shillings and sent him on his way. It was later said that the lion by the ant was slain. Richard died in his mother's arms at 41. His heart was buried at Rouen in Normandy, his entrails at Châlus, where he died, and the rest of his body at the feet of his mother and father at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou. Richard had been king for 9 years, but spent only 6 months in England. He got his wish and was portrayed as a hero in the Robin Hood stories, while his brother John was painted as a villain grasping at power. John wasn't rightfully next in line. That honor went to his dead elder brother Geoffrey's 13-year-old son Arthur, but John had his nephew drowned. A group of discontented barons forced the king to sign a treaty which limited his power. The Magna Carta was the precursor to modern constitutions. The furious monarch marched through the country at the head of a hired foreign army, crushing the barons who had opposed him. On his way to a battle, John took a shortcut and marched his men across an estuary. He miscalculated the tides, and many soldiers, horses, baggage carts, and the crown jewels were sucked into quicksand and whirlpools, or washed into the North Sea. Devastated, John escaped to a local monastery. There he drowned his sorrows in the monk's brew, which gave him dysentery. He died at 49. The people of London did not want the despised king's body brought back to Westminster, so he was laid to rest at Worcester Cathedral. Henry III was only 9. He grew up under the thumb of the barons, and was then wrapped around the finger of his wife, Eleanor of Provence. He spent buckets of money on her relatives' foreign wars. Rebellion broke out in England, and Simon de Montfort captured the king and took over the country. But Henry's son, Prince Edward, defeated the insolent baron and had him publicly dismembered. Though his father was still technically king, Edward was really in charge. The prince left to go on crusade. In his absence, King Henry, now 69, grew ill and depressed. He made a bold announcement that he too would go on crusade, but he never made it out of bed. Henry III died after occupying the throne for 58 years, but never really ruling. Before this point, a king's reign was not considered to have begun until the crown was placed on his head. But Edward was in no rush to leave the fun of the Crusades, so he was proclaimed king while in Sicily. From then on, the coronation was just a formality. Henry was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey under a gilt brass effigy. His wife was eager to have him canonized. 18 years after his death, his body was exhumed and found to be well preserved, a sign of saintly virtue. People began to attribute miracles to his tomb, but his son was skeptical and put an end to the talk of making his father a saint. Edward I was a warrior through and through. He spiked the Welsh princes' heads on the Tower of London and gave their title to his son. He expelled the Jews from England. When his wife Eleanor died, worn out by 16 childbirths, he paraded her coffin from Lincoln to London and built memorial crosses at 12 stops along the way. Edward's ultimate mission was to conquer Scotland. He stole the Stone of Scone, on which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, and placed it in his own coronation chair. But William Wallace and Robert the Bruce stood up to him, and he was unable to rule the whole of the island. While on campaign in the north, the king contracted dysentery and grew weak. When his servants lifted him up to feed him, he died in their arms at 68. According to legend, Edward's dying request was to have his bones carried at the head of the army that would subjugate the Scots. But this didn't happen. His body was carried to Westminster Abbey and buried in an unusually plain marble sarcophagus with no effigy, probably because he had spent everything in the royal coffers on his conquests. On the side of his tomb was inscribed in Latin, "Here is Edward I, Hammer of the Scots." Edward II had no interest in war, much to his father's devastation. He preferred to spend his time with his lover, Piers Gaveston. Their relationship so enraged the nobles that they ran Piers through with swords and beheaded him. Devastated as he was, the king soon found a new lover, Hugh Despenser. He pushed the king into war with his barons and repeatedly humiliated and abused Edward's queen, Isabella of France. She finally had enough and went home. She returned with an army, captured Edward, and had Despenser hanged, drawn, and quartered. The former king was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle and most likely murdered on his wife's orders. Rumors spread that he had been impaled with a red-hot poker. However, most historians now dismiss this as a homophobic folktale. Edward's body was embalmed and his heart removed, placed in a silver casket, and later buried with Isabella. Several cathedrals refused to take in the late king, but Gloucester Abbey accepted him. His grand funeral was delayed for 3 months, so his young son, now Edward III, could attend. By this time, the royal remains were in rough shape, so they were concealed in a coffin, and a wooden effigy with a copper crown was displayed instead. This was the first of many funerary effigies in England. Gloucester Abbey had no other dead saints or kings, so they portrayed Edward as a tortured martyr and attributed miracles to his tomb. This attracted a lot of pilgrims and donations. A century after Edward's death, another gay king, Richard II, supported a bid to have him canonized, but the effort failed. Edward's tomb was restored in 2008 at a cost of £100,000. Edward III was crowned at 15. He sent many other poor souls to their graves by claiming the French throne and starting the 100 Years' War. He founded the Order of the Garter to reward his favored knights. The Black Death struck Europe in 1348 and killed a third of the population. The king survived, but he lost a daughter and a grandson to the plague. His son and heir, Edward the Black Prince, contracted dysentery on a French battlefield and was so distraught when his 5-year-old son died of the plague that he passed away at 45. The king was called to his son's deathbed, and depression soon ravaged his health as well. He developed a large abscess, which burst and became infected. He could choke down only broth and fine white bread soaked in warm goat's milk. The dying king was transported down the River Thames to Sheen Palace. As the royal barge passed the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament was in session, the lords came out and cheered him. Edward's queen, Philippa of Hainaut, was already 8 years in the ground, but his young and beautiful mistress, Alice Pers, was by his side, offering comfort as he drew his last breath. Edward died at 64, after 50 years on the throne. His wooden funeral effigy was carved from a death mask and bears signs of the twisted face associated with a fatal stroke. His body was embalmed and carried to Westminster Abbey in London. 1,700 torches lit the king's way along his 3-day journey. He was interred in the chapel of Edward the Confessor, in a marble tomb decorated with images of his 13 children and topped with a gilt bronze effigy. His jealous descendants had his beloved Alice tried for corruption. Her property was seized and she was exiled from England. Richard II was 10 when he inherited the throne from his grandfather. In the wake of the Black Death, peasants were more aware of their social inequality and revolted. When rebel leader Wat Tyler met with the king, he was stabbed to death by the mayor of London. 14-year-old Richard managed to calm the rebels by promising them safe conduct, but he later sent his army to hunt them down. Richard next made the nobles hate him by pulling out of the war with France, which was keeping them rich. He tried to rehab his reputation and was the first king of England to have his portrait painted. But he was captured by his cousin, Henry, forced to abdicate and imprisoned. The new king allowed his cousin to live. But when loyal knights plotted to assassinate Henry, it became clear that the ex-monarch could not be allowed to continue drawing breath. There were rumors and plenty of graphic illustrations that claim Richard was violently axed to death, even by the hand of his own cousin, Henry. But the evidence suggests that he was probably starved to death in his cell at Pontefract Castle. He was 32. Richard's will stated that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey, in the spectacular double tomb he had built for himself and his beloved wife, Anne, who had died of the plague. But Henry wanted his predecessor forgotten, so after displaying his corpse in St. Paul's Cathedral, he had him buried in out-of-the-way King's Langley Priory. Henry IV jumped the line of succession and was not the rightful king. But as he had gone through the trouble of murdering Richard II, he took the crown anyway. His illegal claim haunted him, and he became paranoid and oppressive. Anyone who questioned his right to rule was likely to be disemboweled. A man in Scotland claimed that he was King Richard and had escaped. He was probably mentally ill, but he stirred rebellion nonetheless. Henry fought ferociously and personally killed 30 rebels. The Pretender was also slain, but the incident was enough to inspire Henry to exhume Richard II to prove that he had been dead all along. He was reburied in Westminster Abbey, next to Anne. Henry's paranoia began to manifest in physical symptoms. He suffered a disfiguring skin disease, possibly leprosy or psoriasis, and acute attacks of illness, which could have been epilepsy. His opponents considered this divine retribution for his cruelty. Henry had been given a prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem, so he figured, no problem, I'll never go on crusade and therefore never die. But in 1413, the ailing 45-year-old king was in Westminster Abbey attending a meeting of Parliament when he suffered a seizure. He was carried into the Jerusalem chamber of the Abbey, where he died. He was laid to rest in Canterbury Cathedral, directly adjacent to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. This was a calculated PR move to associate his newly established royal line with the English saint, who had become even more popular with the publishing of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Henry's queen, Joan of Navarre, paid for a magnificent alabaster and gilt tomb, which she eventually shared with her husband. This went a long way to legitimizing the reign of their son. In 1832, Henry was exhumed, and historians confirmed that his effigy was an excellent likeness of his well-preserved corpse. Henry V nearly died at 16. While fighting a rebellion in Wales, the prince was struck in the left cheek with an arrow. Any other soldier would have been left for dead, but royal physicians were determined to save the heir to the throne. A special screw was invented to extract the arrowhead without inflicting further damage. The wound was flushed with alcohol and treated with honey. Medieval doctors did not know that these were antiseptics, or even that germs existed, but they did know that these treatments helped. They saved Henry's life. He grew up with a wicked battle scar and inherited the throne at 25. As king, he stabilized England and returned to war with France. The French king, Charles VI, was mentally ill. He murdered his attendants in a rage and believed that he was made of glass and could break at any moment. Henry killed a good portion of the French aristocracy at the Battle of Agincourt. He forced Charles to name him heir to the French throne and married his sister, Catherine of Valois. Everything seemed wonderful for England and their popular young warrior king. He bid his wife and baby son farewell and returned to France to continue sacking her homeland. While laying siege to the city of Meaux, the 35-year-old warrior contracted a serious illness. Most likely it was dysentery, though smallpox, erysipelas, and leprosy have also been suggested. After a few weeks in bed, the king was feeling better. He mounted his horse and began to lead his army on to the next battle. But riding in full armor in the summer sun caused heat stroke, and he was forced back to bed. The frustrated, feverish king stubbornly tried one last time to mount his horse, but he could not muster the strength. He was carried back to the Château de Vincennes, where he spent a few more weeks weakening, before death swallowed the hero of Agincourt. His knights carried his body back across the Channel to Westminster Abbey in London. Henry VI was 10 months old when the crown was placed on his tiny bald head. He would have been king of France too, but Joan of Arc defeated the English army. Henry grew into a pious and studious man, but he developed mental illness, likely the same as his uncle Charles VI of France. He lost his memory, control of his body, and the ability to speak. His inability to rule left him vulnerable to his cousins who coveted the crown. Thus, the Wars of the Roses blossomed. The king became a pawn. Whichever side controlled him controlled the country. In 1461, he was deposed by his cousin, Edward IV. The king was kept alive in the Tower of London, so the throne would not rightfully pass to his healthy son, Edward, Prince of Wales. But when the 17-year-old heir was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, his 49-year-old father was now a liability. On the morning of May 22, 1471, King Henry VI was carried out of the Tower, feet first. The official word was that the king had expired from melancholia after learning of his son's tragic death. He was hastily buried at Chertsey Abbey in Surrey, and Edward IV had himself crowned again in Westminster Abbey the same day. But rumors persisted that Henry had been murdered. According to tradition, he was slain while kneeling to pray at an altar in the Wakefield Tower. A stone now marks the spot. Some even claim that he was killed by Edward's little brother, the future Richard III, though this seems too villainous to be true. While Richard was on the throne, miracles were attributed to Henry's tomb, so he was moved to St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, where he rests to this day. Henry's body was exhumed in 1910. His skull was found damaged and his light brown hair covered in blood, confirming that he had indeed died by violence. Edward IV secured the throne for himself, then proceeded to thoroughly enjoy the pleasures of being king, particularly royal banquets. The late medieval upper class ate a diet rich in meat and poor in vegetables. What's more, sugar was now available to those who could afford it. Sweetened wine and sweet meats, aka desserts, were all the rage. King Edward so enjoyed it all that he regularly ate and drank his fill, then asked his physician, who always attended him at table, for an emetic. The king would vomit up his dinner, then return to the table for the delight of gorging his stomach once more. The once athletic warrior became morbidly obese. After the feast of Easter 1483, Edward took to his bed and updated his will. He left the throne to his son, Edward, and the regency to his brother, Richard. Edward IV died at 40. His demise baffled his doctors, who suspected poison, but modern medical historians see an obvious link between his eating disorder and some form of apoplexy, possibly a stroke, aortic aneurysm, or heart attack. Edward IV was buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Edward V was only 12 and vulnerable. His maternal family, the Woodvilles, wanted to keep control of the young king. They attempted to hide Edward, but his uncle Richard seized him and took he and his younger brother, also called Richard, to the Tower of London. He claimed this was for their protection, but he kept finding excuses to postpone the coronation. In the meantime, Richard uncovered a priest who swore that Edward IV had been betrothed to another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. Thus, their union was illegal and their children illegitimate. Richard III had himself crowned on June 26, 1483. Throughout that summer, the two boys were occasionally seen playing on the battlements, but after August, they were never seen again. Richard III is the most obvious suspect, and it has long been imagined, including by William Shakespeare, that he ordered his henchmen to smother the children in their sleep. But there are alternative theories, and many who defend Richard. In 2023, historian Philippa Langley published a book detailing evidence which hints that Edward and Richard actually escaped the Tower. There were two notable pretenders who claimed to be the princes. A man named Perkin Warbeck came forth as the rightful king. He led a small army against Henry VII, but was defeated and hanged. Most of the evidence about what really befell young Edward and Richard is circumstantial. What could potentially definitively prove what became of them is a forensic examination of the two separate sets of bones which might belong to the unfortunate princes. In 1674, workmen in the Tower discovered the skeletons of two children buried under a stairwell. They were placed in Westminster Abbey in an urn bearing the names of King Edward V and Prince Richard. The urn was opened in 1933. It was discovered that the skeletons were incomplete and some of the bones were from an animal. In 1789, workmen carrying out repairs in St. George's Chapel accidentally broke into the vault of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. They discovered the coffins of 2 unidentified children, which could very well be the remains of Edward and Richard, buried with their parents for all of these years. As DNA and forensic science have advanced, there have been repeated requests to reopen the urn and the tomb. A matrilineal descendant of Elizabeth Woodville has offered a DNA sample for comparison. However, thus far, the royal family and the Church of England have denied petitions to study the bones. So for now, the case of the princes in the Tower remains open. Richard III didn't get to enjoy his ill-gotten throne for long. 2 years into his reign, another crown contender, Henry Tudor, marched against him. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, eyewitnesses reported that King Richard's head was bashed in and his helmet driven into his skull. According to legend, Richard's battle crown was found under a bush and placed on the head of the victor, now King Henry VII, ending the Wars of the Roses and establishing the new Tudor dynasty. It benefited the Tudors to paint Richard III as a villain, and the princes in the Tower as definitely dead and not liable to pop up with a stronger claim to the throne. Shakespeare, writing under the patronage of Tudor Elizabeth I, portrayed Richard as one of England's most heinous villains, with a crooked back to match his twisted soul. In 2012, Philippa Langley tracked down the location of Greyfriars Church, where the slain king had been hastily buried. It was now a car park, which was dug up under a painted letter R for reserved parking, or perhaps more cosmically for Richard or Rex. The skeleton of a 15th century man was discovered. Forensic pathologists used DNA to confirm that the remains were indeed those of Richard III. They found he had suffered multiple serious head wounds, the worst of which would have left his brain exposed and certainly resulted in death. Additionally, he suffered from scoliosis, which would have made one of his shoulders noticeably higher than the other, thus confirming Richard's legendary hunchback. The long-lost remains of King Richard III were laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral under a stone tomb fit for a king. Keep your spades handy. In the next episode, we'll dig up the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, 2 of whom lost their heads to the axe, 2 sacrificed their health to overindulgence, and 1 damaged his kidneys by playing with mercury. You can see the whole series now for as little as $1 on Patreon. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.